Michelle Corfield. Welcome to this special edition of Conversations That Matter as we take a look at what the implications of the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I can roll that off my tongue pretty good now, huh? Because I'm now sensitive to calling it the,
UNDRIP.
Yeah. I now don't like the term.
No.
But, all joking aside, what brings you here today? Why is it important that you be here when we're taking a look at what the possible ramifications are on the economy and the business sector in British Columbia?
Well, I'm heavily involved in business, as I said, right, with the executive in residence at SFU on the Indigenous Business MBA, which is all about business.
Yes.
And I've spent a lot of time this past year working on economic development toolkits. And my own interest in business is it's time to move the conversation forward. And how are we going to do that? So this piece of legislation enables us to have a deeper conversation all across the board. Mm-hmm. Federal government, proponents, First Nations, because number one, it says we exist. It recognizes us. Mm-hmm. I was the vice president of Ucluelet Tribal Council when we went to court against the federal government on our economic fishing case.
Yeah.
And I wasn't even recognized as a human being at that. That was the most disturbing part of the court case, was that we were not seen as being human. So we weren't identifiable. And that played out in the courtroom. And that's probably the biggest hurt you take away from that. So this piece of legislation says, yes, you exist. Yes, you're here. Mm-hmm. And we recognize you. And we recognize that you have rights.
Okay.
As every other Canadian citizen, you have some rights to some human dignity.
And rightly so. So when we take a look at what Silcoteen meant.
Yes.
Because much when it comes to the development of economic opportunities and the relationship to resources in Canada now requires, in essence, what UNDRIP suggests.
Yeah.
You can't do it without pre-informed prior consent, consultation, and agreement. So why do we need UNDRIP when we already have Silcoteen?
Well, most of the court cases that have been won in BC very few of them have been actually implemented in their entirety. And the meanings and the definitions behind those, we have Hyistuup, we have Delgamuuk, we have the Ucluelet case. That's the most recent the right to commercial fish. That still hasn't been implemented. Mm-hmm. So all of these things, Sparrow, I think, is implemented to some degree, and Gurren, but all of those cases have taken long, hard battles to get implemented. UNDRIP, by that being a piece of legislation, that's the foundation by which all of the other, ministries have to act.
Right.
So in order for our provincial criminal code or provincial laws, and they have to actually meet this test of UNDRIP.
Right.
So that's a change. So child welfare legislation has to change. So every single provincial piece of legislation has to be able to uphold this piece of legislation. So there's going to be a lot of change internally. Mm-hmm. And when you're doing that big C change, is what I would see, nobody likes change. Mm-hmm. So it's going to you're going to see some resistance. People are going to create this ambiguity when it doesn't really exist, and try to fearmonger people.
Well, that's because they fall back into that us versus them mentality, when this is really about us.
Yeah. It's about our relationship. Mm-hmm. It's about recognition, about seeing each other as equals, about how are we going to coexist? How are my beliefs and values going to be able to be held up against Canadian beliefs and values, and where can they interconnect?
Yes.
Right? It's about joining, finally, recognition.
But is that not what the Canadian experience has supposedly been anyways? We are a coming together of peoples. I was at an event, sorry, I did a quick jump right there, but I was at an event back when they dedicated the China Gate leading into Chinatown. And then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien said something that really moved me, and it still does. He said, we have invited people from around the world to come and join us in the building of a truly blessed nation. But that statement didn't include Indigenous people.
No.
And isn't that what we would really rather have? The world keeps moving, people keep moving. It is this coming together, sharing of experiences and cultures, hopefully for the betterment of one another, which hasn't been the Canadian experience, especially when it comes to our relationship with Indigenous people.
No, and it certainly hasn't changed much, except in the last few years, since since King James, I think it was 1793.
1763, the Royal Proclamation.
Yes. Nothing's changed, right?
Right.
So that was supposed to say, here, set aside those lands, protect those people. And yet we've seen just decimation, right? The Trutch years and all of that.
Right.
So I think Canadians primarily, specifically, in the 1900s, were raised to believe that natives didn't exist.
Right.
That they were dirty, that they weren't people, right?
Yeah.
Treat them different. They're less than.
Right.
And I think that change is coming slowly, that people are seeing it. Like in my daughter's generation, I know that she doesn't feel half of the things I felt growing up.
Yeah.
So I don't understand why we got to the place we were. And I admire Pierre Trudeau, multiculturalism.
Yeah.
He opened it up then, but did we get far enough with the section, with the constitutional changes? We got some recognition that your rights exist. We got some affirmation, but we didn't get any collectiveness, laws recognized. So we didn't come together then. And I wonder sometimes if it was First Nations needed to still feel protected and keep everything close. So not to share, not to want to bring other people in and be influenced by that. And I think now people are saying, no, come in. I want to share now.
Right.
And I hope we can change this.
So when we take a look at the business landscape going forward, I'm somebody who wants to invest in resources in Canada. And I go, okay, I now understand my obligation is to engage with First Nations. How does that process look moving forward?
Well, I always say engage early.
People
will disagree with this statement because they already have. I think if you're dealing in a specific core territory and you know that that's the only your only nation that you have to deal with, engage early. Tell them this is what I intend to do, and I'll be back when I'm ready to talk and we have more things figured out.
Yeah.
If you engage too soon and keep engagement up, expectations are raised, and you can't always meet those. And I think coming together to understand what the project is and how that project will impact the land or not impact the land gives that First Nation the opportunity to think about it, to research it, to figure out how they want to be involved.
Yes.
And that is a better place. Multi-nation, first thing you need to do is establish trust. Establish trust. And I said, bring that first meeting, bring everybody together.
Yeah.
And people disagreed with that. But I know if we're going to do business in, let's take Roberts Bank T2.
Okay.
All those separate conversations are happening around that. Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh. Everybody's having these conversations. But now you're going to have all these agreements that are made. And then next thing you know, they're going to meet and go, well, what did you.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think it's better to bring everybody together, especially when we're talking about things such as Roberts Bank, because there will be cumulative effects that are not going to just impact the First Nations, they're going to impact British Columbians.
Yes.
And until we start having those conversations, that we open up the conversation for everybody to be at the table to say, this is what it looks like. How can we do this collectively? And how can we all be involved? That's a much stronger foundation.
Well, sure, and it speaks to the fact that anybody can figure out how to work together. First Nations do not need to be kept apart from one another. They can work together the same way that the companies can have joint or limited partnerships as well.
Yeah.
All we have to do is just take a look at the initiative to address housing in the Greater Vancouver area.
Yeah.
The Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nation. You were involved in that, weren't you? So when we take a look at that process, how did it unfold, and how does it speak to the future about what First Nations can offer from an economic development and prosperity perspective?
$1.5 billion worth of land holdings.
Yeah.
3 nations working together, having the same conversations at the same time, building trust. And they had to build trust amongst each other because they became partners with themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then they invited another partner in, or several. There might be a few more now.
Yeah.
But they had to build that foundational trust amongst themselves to say, this is what we want to do in business. These are our values. These are our principles. But they had to be jointly developed.
Yes.
And the time that it took was a bit of time, but we got through it quite quickly. But
there are many in the development sector in British Columbia who would look at the speed at which that happened and say that happened at lightning speed.
Oh, well, in my perspective, we could have gone a little bit faster, but we had more meetings to make sure that we understood what the values were going to be collectively.
Mm-hmm.
So those principles and values now guide that whole development.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what partner comes in because everybody knows what the values are, what the principles are, what the priorities are.
Mm-hmm.
They're established and they're
Yeah.
agreed to. It makes complete sense that you would bring them together because then you can go have a separate agreement, like an impact benefit agreement with this nation will be built on the same principles, values, and conditions. So go have your separate conversations, but once you establish that foundational piece of trust and a
Yeah.
relationship, then you can move forward.
Right. And so this goes just to prove the point that UNDRIP is not something that we need to fear. As a matter of fact, it consolidates everything and establishes a framework that allows us to move forward, probably with much greater clarity.
Absolutely. UNDRIP, everybody can read it. Everybody can come to terms that this is the foundational piece that we're going to follow. When we brought in referral processes and consultation and accommodation, there was no guided process.
Mm-hmm.
And so that left a lot for ambiguity. The ambiguity now is a little different.
Yeah.
We now know we have to meet these standards. And the federal government coming back on TMX, right? Having to re-enter those negotiations with all 117 First Nations on the line.
Mm-hmm.
And when people say, well, you can't bring them together, I've seen all those 117 nations in the same room,
Yeah.
having the same discussion about the environment, cumulative effects, the priorities.
Yes.
And so when you have those negotiations independently, everybody's building off of a similar foundation.
Right.
It makes sense.
It certainly does.
And that's where I see the ultimate, right? Like, I think the courts did a good job in saying you had to go back, but now I think there's some clear processes.
Okay, wearing my own biases on my sleeve, I hope that this is a very important moment as we move forward to greater social justice and greater economic opportunity for all of us.
Absolutely.
All of us. And as Chief Joseph pointed out, let's embrace our common humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a prime example for me
Yeah.
is I think we have done injustice to our urban Aboriginal people, and especially our most vulnerable populations. With economic prosperity, hopefully we can invest in those people that are in dire need of support,
Right.
because they too deserve to have those UNDRIP standards.
I agree with you completely. Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
very
Thanks
much.
for doing this. Yes.